Scott Summers is the son of Major Christopher Summers and Catherine Ann. His younger brother is Alex Summers, the mutant who would later become Havoc. During a flight back from a family vacation, his plane was attacked by a Sheer Empire ship. Catherine placed the only parachute on her children and threw them out of the plane to save their lives. The parachute began to catch fire, so Scott used his optic beams for the first time to slow his fall. The boy suffered a head injury upon landing that damaged the part of his brain that would have allowed him to control his mutant powers. The two children were hospitalized and both suffered traumatic amnesia from the incident. Mr. Sinister discovered the existence of the Summers brothers and became interested in them. The geneticist considered that Scott had greater potential, so he adopted Alex in order to separate him from his brother and make his brother emotionally vulnerable. One night, Scott woke up and destroyed the roof of the hospital with his optic blast. When he woke up again, a year had passed. Upon recovery, Scott was placed in an orphanage in Nebraska. There he was subjected to a series of tests and experiments by the orphanage's owner, Mr. Milbury, who was actually Mr. Sinister. The villain harassed the boy constantly and made sure to prevent him from being adopted. As a teenager, Scott began to suffer severe headaches and lost control of his powers. Sinister, disguised as a specialist, gave him ruby quartz lenses to control his optic rays. Shortly after, Scott's mutant power erupted from his eyes as an uncontrollable explosion of optic force. This endangered the lives of several civilians. The young man managed to save them, but the crowd believed he had tried to kill them, so he fled on a freight train. He later met criminal Jack Winters, also known as Jack O'Diamonds. The villain attempted to use Scott's powers to commit crimes and physically abused him. However, Scott had attracted the attention of Charles Xavier, who saved him and recruited him into the first member of the X-Men. Xavier gave him a special visor, with which he could launch his optical rays at will. Along with Angel, Beast, Iceman and Marvel Girl, they formed the original X-Men. Under the name Cyclops, he fought for the dream of a world where humans and mutants could coexist in peace. Over time, he fell in love with Jean Grey, but due to her conservative attitude, it was difficult for him to express his feelings to her. When Professor Xavier was apparently murdered, Fred Duncan ordered the X-Men to be disbanded. Upon reading Professor Xavier's will, his fortune would be used for a trust fund, the mansion would become the property of the X-Men, and Scott would act as trustee of both the fund and the school. As usual in the comics, the professor would return in later stories and everything returned to the status quo. Scott was reunited with his brother when he saved him from the living Pharaoh. Eventually, the youngest Summers decided to join the X-Men under the codename Havoc. When most of his original students were captured by Krakoa, Professor Xavier sent another team of mutants to save them. One of its members was Gabriel, also known as Kid Vulcan, Alex and Scott's long-lost brother. After the team freed Cyclops, they were apparently killed. Scott escaped, but Professor Xavier erased the traumatizing event from Cyclops' memories. Following this, he formed a third team led by Scott to save the captured X-Men. When Jean Grey and the other original X-Men left the group following the formation of the new X-Men, Cyclops remained as deputy leader, feeling that he would never be able to lead a normal life due to the uncontrollable nature of his powers. Still, she continued her romantic relationship with Jean. Unfortunately, Thunderbird died during the new team's first mission and her death haunted Cyclops for a long time. After the Phoenix Force took Jean Grey's place in the X-Men, the Firebird maintained a romantic relationship with Scott without the latter knowing that she was not the woman he loved. The X-Men traveled to the crystal homeworld of Macron where they met Christopher Summers, Cyclops' long-lost father, who had become a space pirate named Corsair and leader of the Starjammers. Scott's father was not prepared to face his son after abandoning him for so many years due to his kidnapping by the Sheer. That was why he left without revealing his identity to Cyclops. Due to Jean's personality change after becoming Phoenix, Scott broke up with her and dated Colleen Wing before returning to his first love. While attempting to infiltrate the evil Hellfire Club, the Phoenix fell under Mastermind's control. When freed, the bird underwent another transformation becoming Dark Phoenix. In this state he devoured a star, murdering 5 billion inhabitants of a sheer planet. Upon returning to Earth, the bird attempted to eliminate the X-Men, but Professor X managed to suppress Dark Phoenix's personality. The Sheer Empire subjected the X-Men to a trial by combat where Jean Grey's fate would be decided by the lives she had taken. In the end, Phoenix decided to take his own life before the eyes of a terrified Cyclops. The leader of the X-Men abandoned the team when he believed his beloved had died. Cyclops traveled for a time and then rejoined the X-Men to stop Magneto. When Corsair came to Earth for help, Scott recognized a certain locket he was wearing that contained photographs of the Summers family. At first, Scott was very angry at his father for hiding his identity from him, but he decided to forgive him in the end. After this, Scott introduced him to his brother Alex, who was now an adult. Scott's grandparents owned North Star Airways, a shipping company in Alaska. During a family gathering, he met Madeline Pryor, a pilot who bore a strong resemblance to Jean Grey. Scott fell in love with her and the two began a relationship. Later, they got married and the mutant decided to stop being a hero to have a normal life. Scott met Rachel Summers, his daughter with Jean from an alternate future. She called herself Phoenix and wore an outfit very similar to her mother's. Because in this world her father was married to another woman, Rachel kept her true identity a secret, in addition to Scott disowning her for believing that Rachel had taken over Jean's identity. Shortly after, Madeline revealed that she was pregnant. Scott was forced to return to the X-Men when Magneto joined the team. His wife agreed to live in the mansion and gave birth to their son Nathan Christopher Charles Summers. After Xavier was forced to leave Earth due to his health, Scott battled Storm for undisputed leadership of the X-Men and the New Mutants. Madeline, who was already tired of being displaced by her husband, used her telepathic powers to influence the outcome of the fight. In the end, Cyclops lost and left the team to live with his family in Alaska. Scott became very distant with his family and everything got worse when he found out that it was Phoenix who committed suicide on the moon and that the real Jean Grey was still alive. The two met in X-Factor, a team made up of the original X-Men that sought out and trained young mutants in the correct use of their powers. Finally, Mr. Sinister sent his men to kidnap Nathan. Madeline could not prevent it and fell into a coma after the attack. When she woke up, she felt great insecurity when she saw that Scott had reunited with Jean Grey. This caused her to lose her sanity and allowed a pair of demons to approach her and grant her demonic powers. As Goblin Queen, Madeline vowed to destroy Cyclops alongside the members of the X-Men and X-Factor. Madeline discovered that she was actually a clone of Jean Grey created by Mr. Sinister in order for her to father a child with Scott. Furious, the villain subdued Sinister and decided to sacrifice her own son to open a portal that would connect Earth to Limbo. Scott tried to talk to her, but Goblin Queen blamed him and Jean for everything bad in her life. In the end, Jean, with the help of the Phoenix, defeated Madeline and she died in her husband's arms. In revenge, Cyclops sought out Sinister and seemingly killed him for everything he had done. After this, Jean agreed to raise Nathan with Scott. Scott decided to take Nathan with him on missions. The infantryman was capable of creating a force field that protected him from threats. Scott asked Jean to marry him, but she rejected him because she wasn't sure if she really loved him, or if it was the memories of Madeline and the Phoenix that made her feel that way. Rachel revealed the truth of her origin to her parents and after this, she joined their small family. Apocalypse kidnapped Nathan and infected him with the techno-organic virus. A woman from the future named Sister Ascani claimed that in her time there was medicine capable of curing her son, but it could only take Nathan. Scott had no choice and decided to give up his son to save his life. After a fight with Shadow King, X-Factor dissolved and together with the X-Men, they created two new groups. The Gold Team led by Storm and the Blue Team led by Cyclops. Psylocke, who was his teammate, attempted to lure Cyclops into infidelity by influencing his mind behind Jean's back. Meanwhile, a mysterious soldier named Cable gathered the members of the New Mutants and created X-Force. Sinister returned, and together with the villain Strife, captured Cable, Jean and Scott. These forced the mutant from the future to reveal that he was Nathan and that he had returned to take revenge on his parents for abandoning him. Jean and Scott tried to convince him that they had done it for his own good. Cable and Strife disappeared into the temporal stream after a temporal device exploded. Scott thought he had lost his son for the second time. After another confrontation with Strife, Jean proposed to Scott and the two were married outside the Xavier mansion. While on their honeymoon on the beaches of St. Bart's, Scott and Jean's consciousnesses were taken 2,000 years into the future by an elderly Rachel, who had become Mother Ascani, the same woman who took Nathan to the sea. Future. Since their own bodies could not have survived the time travel, the Apreja had to inhabit new cloned bodies of their descendants. Under the aliases Red and Slim Dayspring, Jean and Scott raised the boy together for 12 years before returning to their own time. During the Avalon Station disaster, Charles' mind wiped Magneto after the Master of Magnetism nearly killed Wolverine. This caused Eric's psyche to merge with Charles's, giving rise to Onslaught. Although the X-Men defeated the evil entity and freed Professor Xavier, most of Earth's heroes were lost for a time. Professor Xavier was left helpless after Onslaught's defeat and was arrested for his role in the events. Scott and Jean were named leaders of the X-Men and co-headmasters of the school. During one of his plans to conquer the world, Apocalypse took over Scott's body, but thanks to the X-Men, he managed to regain control of his body. Scott returned to the X-Men, but his fusion with Apocalypse had made him even more somber and serious than before, as well as making him question his life. As a result, many of his relationships became strained, including his marriage to Jean. At that time, This prevented him from being able to help Scott overcome Apocalypse's possession. The two grew further apart and Cyclops sought out a therapist, Emma Frost, a reformed villainess, to help him. Together they began a psychic affair. Jean discovered them and confronted Scott only to find out that her husband never had a carnal relationship with Frost. Upset by their distrust, Cyclops abandoned the X-Men. Sometime later, the villain Zorn impersonated Magneto and killed Jean Grey. Heartbroken, Cyclops left the superhero life, which led to a post-apocalyptic future. Jean was revived in this future and using the powers of the White Phoenix of the Crown, she rewrote history so that Scott began a relationship with Emma Frost, which prevented him from leaving the X-Men after Jean's death and the events that would cause that terrible future, but making the rest of the X-Men angry with Scott for feeling that he had betrayed his love for Jean. Deciding that the X-Men needed to play a more proactive role in rescue and emergency aid, and thus bring positive attention to mutants, Scott created a new group of not long after. The X-Men Danger Room became sentient, attacked the team, and sought to kill Charles. Danger, as she called herself, revealed to them that Xavier was aware of her existence, but decided to ignore her and turn her into a slave who would train the X-Men. Upset by this revelation, Scott and the rest decided to cut ties with the Professor. After M-Day, the energy previously possessed by powerless mutants began to orbit the Earth. Passing some rocks in orbit, the energy awakened Vulcan, Scott's long-lost brother, who returned to Earth. Vulcan, surprised that Scott did not recognize him, attacked and easily defeated several members of the X-Men and kidnapped Cyclops. When Scott asked him why he didn't remember any of the events surrounding Vulcan rescuing him from Krakoa, Professor Xavier confirmed that he had erased the memories from Scott's mind. After hearing this, Gabriel left the place stating that he despised what the X-Men had become and that he no longer considered Scott and Alex his brothers. This further damaged Cyclops' already strained relationship with his mentor. When the first New Mutant baby was born after M-Day, the Marauders, Cable and the X-Men began a race to get the baby. The search for the mutant messiah ended when Professor Xavier convinced Cyclops to allow Cable to escape to the future with the little girl. Cable teleported to the future, just as Bishop shot the boy. The shot missed her and hit Professor Xavier in the head. Cyclops hit Bishop with an optic blast and declared that the X-Men would disband. Cyclops reformed the X-Men in San Francisco after the city's mayor, Sadie Sinclair, decided to openly support mutants. Madeline returned as a psychic ghost and attempted to take over the deceased Jean's body. Scott, who was already expecting something like this, replaced his beloved's body, and Madeline's spirit was trapped in a body that later rejected her. Apparently, Goblin Queen's soul vanished after this event. Simon Trask tricked the media into believing that the mutants were terrorists who had killed hundreds of people during Hope Summers' birth. Being the leader of the X-Men, Cyclops received the harshest criticism and was ultimately captured and imprisoned by Norman Osborn's Dark Avengers. After escaping, Summers created the mutant nation of Utopia and declared that they rejected Osborn and his brutal methods. Soon, the power of the mutant nation increased thanks to an alliance with Namor. Magneto also joined the X-Men and recognized that Scott had succeeded in uniting the mutant race where he and Xavier had failed. After Kate Kilgore and the new Hellfire Club sent a huge Sentinel to attack Utopia, Cyclops and Wolverine had a fight over whether the children should defend the island or evacuate. The disagreement led to a bloody fight between them, and even though the children defeated the Sentinel, Wolverine decided to leave Utopia, resettle in Westchester County, and open the Jean Grey School. For his part, Cyclops formed a new team of X-Men made up of the most powerful mutants. These would defend the Earth, but were willing to fight humans if they threatened their kind. When the Phoenix Force returned in search of Hope Summers, the Avengers attempted to stop him, which led them to war with the X-Men, as they believed the Phoenix would restore mutants. During the battle, the entity's power split into 5 new hosts, one of which was Cyclops. With this power, the mutants were on the verge of taking control of Earth. Understanding that the Phoenix corrupted Scott, the Avengers and X-Men worked together to stop him, but in the process, Cyclops killed Charles. After losing the Phoenix, Scott was imprisoned, but a rebel faction of the X-Men rescued him. Together they created a new team that would search for young mutants and train them to defend themselves against humans. Due to his contact with the Phoenix, Scott lost control of his powers, but he kept it a secret. Death shortly before the Beyonders destroyed the multiverse. Cyclops' team found a Phoenix egg that they planned to use to stop the incursions that were destroying entire universes. Unfortunately, the egg hatched during the last raid. Cyclops managed to merge with the entity and this time managed to master the power of the White Phoenix. Thanks to the Illuminati, Scott and other heroes managed to survive the raid. Dr. Doom, who had stolen the Beyonders' powers, created a new universe under his command. Cyclops confronted him, but not even with the power of the Phoenix could he confront Victor, who murdered him. Cyclops was resurrected when Reed Richards restored the multiverse and reunited with the X-Men. One day, he and his team of X-Men responded to a distress call from Muir Island. Upon arriving, they discovered their entire staff dead and multiple men in agony. With his dying breath, Madrox informed Scott that the island had been contaminated with the Inhumans' Terrigen Mist, which killed anyone who possessed Gene X. Scott died shortly after due to the mist. Emma, who refused to let her lover die that way, manipulated the X-Men into starting a war against the Inhumans. In the end, a Cyclops created by Emma Frost's powers, died a martyr at the hands of Black Bolt. A young Cable brought his father to life during a crisis in which the X-Men were believed dead. Scott gathered the remaining members and believing that Xavier's dream had completely died, they decided to eliminate the villains they considered a threat to mutants before disbanding the team. Shortly afterward, Charles Xavier, Magneto, and Moira McTaggart established a sovereign mutant nation on Krakoa, and Scott was one of countless mutants who became a part of it. Together with the X-Men, they carried out several missions to ensure the stability of their nation. Cyclops would die in battle with some of Dr. Stasis' creations, publicly bleeding to death in a New York alley. The 5 would quickly resurrect him. To allay suspicions that the mutants might return from the dead, Scott would temporarily adopt the mantle of Captain Krakoa, wearing a battle suit designed by Forge and appearing to wield the powers of flight and chlorokinesis. Scott would not attend the 3rd Hellfire Gala, being ambushed and captured by Orcus forces while mounting an attack on Krakoa. During this attack, several mutants were killed and others were trapped inside the White Hot Room. The villains manipulated the media to point out Krakoa as a terrorist nation. Cyclops would be tried as a representative of the mutant race due to his status as leader of the X-Men, possibly facing the death penalty. We already know that Cyclops will manage to survive this trial, but with mutants once again being feared and hunted, the future of Xavier's dream remains uncertain. But Scott will continue to fight to carry out his mentor's ideals.